pity the Australian Greens did not pass that amendment, because they could have had the voting reforms they say are so important, but coming in at a time that did not suit the government's timetable. And I know that this has been put to them by the Labor movement, and we also know that this is a matter that members of the Greens, including in the Greens party room, are concerned about. This is Senator Rhiannon's answer to that problem, but of course it is no answer, because the commencement date, well, the application date, and I'll come to that, that she is proposing is the 1st of July, which of course suits the government's agenda, because the 2nd is the first day they can hold the double dissolution election. So she's giving them what they want. But I won't reprise that. The questions I have. Well, I can do it in more. I can do it in more than 2.5 minutes if you'd like, Senator Di Natale. 2.5 minutes. It's not a bad sort of summary, I thought. But, you know, the question I have first is this. My recollection, and this, the minister will obviously have advice on this, is the Act itself prescribes the ballot paper. And what this seeks to do, this amendment seeks to do, is to not change the commencement date of the Act, but change, by way of the insertion of application provisions, say that, well, this bit doesn't apply in relation to any election whose polling day is before 1 July 2016. So my first question is about that inconsistency, and I think Senator Collins pointed to that too. I want to understand what is the legal position and the validity of that. Are there any legal concerns arising out of the inconsistency between the— Sorry? I'm asking a question. It's okay. Oh, no, I've lost my train of thought. Don't do that to me when I'm this tired. the inconsistency between commencement and application, that's the first set of questions. Can you talk about the legal validity or legal consequences of that? The second, and I had already flagged that I would be seeking that the minister table any legal advice the government's obtained in relation to that. The second is a practical question, and I can pause if the minister wants to respond to the first. Do you want me to respond? Yeah, I'll do it again. Okay.
The minister.
Thank you, Chair. And I was about to jump up to respond to these questions from Senator Collins, but I was very happy for Senator Wong to take the call first. Firstly, there is no internal inconsistency and there is no legal issue. There is nothing unusual about a relevant part of a bill to have a different commencement date than other parts of a bill. So this amendment that the Greens have moved has a revised commencement date for the revised Senate voting provisions. The revised date is expressed such that the measures will not apply to a polling day before 1 July 2016. Such a commencement date arrangement is not unusual. There were several bills which passed in July 2010 during the period of the previous government, which were expressed to only apply for an election that would occur after the next election. The government is not aware of any legal issue whatsoever. A polling day is, of course, expressed in a writ. So just to make that clear again, the Greens amendment seeks to delay the commencement for a specific and relevant part of the Senate voting arrangements for them not to apply to elections unless they are elections with a polling day after 1 July 2016. But it does enable the AEC to begin preparatory work before that date if required, and that is of course what we would want them to be able to do. So that is a completely routine arrangement in legislation of this sort.
Senator Wong.
Thank you, thank you, Chair. The second question was in relation to the practical implementation. If the election is called for a date after 1 July 2016 and a date such that pre-poll can occur prior to 1st of July 2016, which ballot paper is to be used? Because, as I recall, ballot paper is prescribed in the legislation. The ballot paper that would be now, I assume that what the AEC will tell us is that there is a statutory note in the amendment does that override the ballot paper which is prescribed elsewhere in the Act?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. So obviously the operative word here is that the change commencement arrangements of this bill under this Green amendment only apply to elections with a polling day after 1 July, and so all of the other parts of the usual election, which of course that process being triggered by the issuing of the writ, everything that happens between the writ and polling day would of course take place under the revised arrangements as per this legislation, if the Senate indeed passes this legislation. So the effect of this amendment is that this reform can only apply to an election with a polling day after 1 July 2016, and the advice that we have from the AEC is that that gives them sufficient time to ensure that they can make the necessary adjustments to their systems and provide and also, of course, conduct the necessary and appropriate public education campaigns.
Senator Wong.
Thank you. That's all very well, but I'm asking a specific question about which ballot paper. So, election day. Well, if you did answer it, I didn't understand how that will work in practicality, in practice. Election day after the 1st of July, obviously. Polling day, whatever you call it. I'm sorry, polling day under the Act. Okay. Therefore, pre-poll is prior to the commencement of the application of this part. Does that mean that the new ballot paper, even though this part only commences post the 1st of July, will in effect have a retrospective, will have an earlier application for the purposes of people casting their vote in the pre-poll? If that is the case, what is the legal basis of that? Is it simply the statutory note? Because elsewhere in the Act there is a prescription as to the ballot paper.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Chair. Clearly, I didn't make myself understood well enough. The trigger in the amendment in terms of the commencement date is a polling day after 1 July 2016. The specific answer to Senator Wong's question is that during the pre-poll, the ballot papers will be the same as the ballot papers on polling day post 1 July. And the reason for that is because pre-poll is, of course, an integral part of the election process leading to polling day. It cannot be said that that is a retrospective application whatsoever. As you've already indicated, relevant parts of the bill, if it's passed by the Senate, would take effect on royal assent. But what this amendment does is that these provisions and these revised arrangements, these improved arrangements, these arrangements which will empower voters to determine what happens to their preferences, will not be able to be used until such time for a polling day prior to 1 July 2016. Now, obviously, in the context of any election, there is a well-established process that is very well laid out in the legislation, from issuing of the writs to polling day, and indeed to the return of the writs post-polling day. So there is a well-established process, but the very black and white effect of the amendment that the Greens have moved here is that the revised arrangements under this bill could not take effect into an election prior to 1 July 2016, with a polling day prior to 1 July 2016.
Senator Di Natale.
Thank you, Chair. Look, I'll again be brief, and I'll make my contribution based on the recent contribution from Senator Wong. And I'll use the same standard that Senator Wong applied, which is not reprising my answer but, that was given previously on this debate. But I'll spend a few minutes again just responding to some of those comments. The first thing that, again, needs to be really clear, because there's some confusion about what the commencement date's actually there for. The commencement date is there to ensure that the Australian Electoral Commission are able to do the work that's necessary to get this reform in place before the next election. That's what the issue of a double dissolution is up to the government. It's entirely of their choosing whether this legislation is in place, whether it's not. It's entirely of their choosing. The reason we want this legislation in place is because we believe it is good for democracy, that it's an improvement to the way we elect people to the Senate, because it gives power back to voters and takes it away from us politicians. So our focus is on ensuring that whenever the next election is, that we have this reform in place. So again, just to be clear, we understand the Labor Party disagree with these reforms. We don't. We think they're good. We think they're important. We think they need to be in place at the next election. And that's why the issue of postponing them beyond a double dissolution election simply doesn't make sense. Because what the Labor Party is asking us to do is to say, let's retain a dodgy set of election laws for one more election, when we have the opportunity to say, let's make sure they are in place for the next election, whether that be a double dissolution election or a half-Senate election. The other issue, of course, is again the concession that by adopting these laws we're somehow giving the balance of power over to the Conservative side of politics. I mean, remarkable that Senator Wong seems to know the outcome of the election in the Senate 4 months ahead of time. 4 months ahead of time. No, the reality is that no one knows the outcome of this. The only people that will be deciding the outcome of the next election will be voters, rather than backroom preference dealers. And of course, Senator Wong also mentioned the role of the trade union movement, and it's important that I respond to that by saying we have had a number of calls, emails and letters from trade union members who have said to us that they're disappointed that their fees are being used by the ACTU leadership in an effort to help the Labor Party. And in fact, they are questioning the very role of the ACTU. Does it exist to support their members, or does it exist to support the Labor Party? Because those two things are absolutely not in line, and particularly when it comes to an issue like this. And I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Senator Natali. Is anyone seeking the call? Minister? Okay. The question is that Amendment 2 on sheet 7882 be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Against say no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bell for 4 minutes. Yeah, you've got to do one. What do you...
They've just found it. Lock the doors. The question is that Amendment 2, moved by Senator Rhiannon on sheet 7882, be agreed to. Those that the ayes will move to the right of the chair, the noes to the left of the chair. I appoint Senator Fawcett teller for the ayes and Senator Urquhart teller for the noes. Order. There being 35 ayes and 21 noes, the question is resolved in the negative.
Agreed.
Oh, sorry. It's agreed in the affirmative, yeah. Senator Rhiannon?
I move Greens Amendment number 1 on sheet 7882. This is quite straightforward. It just inserts the heading that is required for this part of the bill.
So, Senator Rhiannon, were you proposing to move Amendment number 3?
Oh, sorry, thank you, I forgot that. I will first need to move Amendment number 3. I withdraw what I just said. I move Greens Amendment number 3 on sheet 7882. Considering the lateness of the hour, I will not go into my comments in detail. It is just the issue of the commencement date, and the issues have been well canvassed.
So the question is that Amendment number 3 on sheet 7882 be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Against say no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. Oh, lock the doors. Question is that Amendment number 3 on sheet 7882 be agreed to. The ayes will move to the right of the chair. The noes to the left of the chair. I appoint Senator Fawcett teller for the ayes and Senator Urquhart teller for the noes. Order. There being 35 ayes and 21 noes, the question is resolved in the affirmative. Senator Rhiannon.
Thank you, Chair. I move Greens Amendment number 1 on sheet 7882. It's very straightforward. This, it just inserts the title on the measures that we've just dealt with in Amendments 2 and 3.
Senator Muir.
Thank you, Chair. I'm seeking a little bit of guidance. I was going to move an amendment to the amendment. I was just seeking a little bit of guidance to see the process from here.
Yes, you can move that now, Senator.
Thank you, Chair. I move Amendment 4 and 5 on sheet 7887 by leave together.
All right, thank you. So that's an amendment to Senator Rhiannon's amendment. Yes, thank you. Did you want to speak to that?
I'll speak very briefly. This amendment omits 1 July 2016 and substitutes with 5th of August 2016. It is delaying the implementation until a general election, or the possibility of a general election. This is very serious changes to our electoral system. It's very vague as to whether the AEC would be able to make the appropriate implementations in time. It is all but mitigating risk. Essentially, as things are with the current date, the Greens are handing the government a double dissolution, or the potential of a double dissolution trigger. But most importantly, there is the risk of administrative errors, and then which of course would raise constitutional issues at the time of the election if votes weren't counted properly, if the implementation that the AEC put in place was not successful.
Do you have it put?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. Just to indicate that the government will not be supporting Senator Muir's amendments to the Green Amendment. We believe that the 1 July date that is part of the Greens Amendment is the appropriate date. It does give sufficient time for the Electoral Commission to do all of the necessary preparation for an effective implementation of these changes at an election. The 5 August date is unnecessarily delaying the effective date of these important changes.
Senator Collins.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. The opposition will not be supporting these amendments. As I explained when I spoke to Senator Rhiannon's amendments, Labor has concerns about the legal efficacy of these application provisions and their interaction with the commencement provisions at Clause 2. Now, I note that Senator Cormann dealt with these issues in part. I must say, at this stage and under this process, we haven't been satisfied by that explanation, and for the same reasons we opposed Senator Rhiannon's amendments, we would oppose these.
Senator Rhiannon.
Thank you, Chair. The Greens will not be supporting these amendments. Any election held after July 1 should be under the new Senate voting system. That's what we're establishing here, and this would rewind that. So I would urge that members do not support these amendments.
So the question is that amendments 4 and 5 on sheet 7887 moved by Senator Muir be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Against say no. I think the noes have it. The noes have it. So the question now before the chair is that amendment number 1 on sheet 7882 moved by Senator Rhiannon be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Against say no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells. 1, 4. Lock the doors. The question is that amendment number 1 on sheet 7882 be agreed to. The ayes will move to the right of the chair, the noes to the left of the chair. I appoint Senator Fawcett Teller for the ayes and Senator Urquhart Teller for the noes. Order. There being 34 ayes and 20 noes, the question is resolved in the affirmative. Yes, Senator Day, I think I'm called in.
Excuse me, Peter, I'm on. Yeah, cheers.
Right. Senator Day.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I move item 1 on sheet 7890. Is that right?
Yes. Did you want to speak to that?
That's the one. Yes, sir. Thank you, Chair. Yeah, that's my notes. Sorry, Chair. The Senate has tried a number of times in this marathon debate to ascertain whether or not it will be an offence to promote just vote 1 above the line, but to no avail. This amendment will mirror the South Australian electoral law, section 126 of the South Australian Electoral Act, which prohibits the distribution of how-to-vote cards and advertising material that encourages or instructs or in any other way promotes a voter to cast their ballot contrary to section 239, which requires more than just 1 in the box. This section, among other things, requires voters to number at least 6 boxes on the Senate ballot paper above the line, or as many as are listed if less than 6 options are available. One only has to look at the underhanded way that Queensland elections allow for advertising that deliberately seeks to exhaust preferences.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, this is probably the issue that we've spent most of the time on in the initial 10 or 11 hours of committee debate. The government does not support these amendments for the reasons that I've previously outlined in some great detail. There is already a prohibition on misleading or deceptive publications which would be likely to mislead or deceive an elector in relation to the casting of a vote, and of course the advice to the voter will be very explicit on the Senate ballot paper, that to vote above the line, that the voter should number at least 1 to 6 boxes above the line in order of preference from 1 to 6, and that to vote below the line, the voter should number at least 12 boxes, 1 to 12, in order of priority below the line. There will, of course, on top of that, be an education campaign by the Australian Electoral Commission to ensure that people across Australia well understand how to vote for the Senate above the line and below the line. We believe that there is no need for additional penalty and offence provisions, and we do not support this amendment.
Senator Lyon-Helm.
Thank you, Chair. I support this amendment. It's substantively similar to mine, and so therefore I'll speak to this one and not to mine. Professor George Williams provided in testimony to the one public hearing of the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters inquiring into the provisions of this bill, and he stated, and I quote, "Further protective measures need to be introduced into the bill to ensure that people are unable to produce how-to-vote cards and other material that could effectively turn this into a de facto vote one system. It is possible for this Parliament to legislate in a way that removes the possibility for exploitation, whereby candidates and parties can advocate a vote that is saved but is clearly not the type of vote that is contemplated by the system. I believe that type of measure is important here." End quote. Dr Kevin Bonham also provided testimony as follows. "It should not be allowed to issue a how-to-vote card that recommends that voters vote in a manner different to the instructions on the ballot paper, and it should also not be allowed to encourage people to do this or publish an advertisement that draws people's attention to the fact that they can do that. Basically, the idea should be that people will just vote one above the line, but voters should not be encouraged to do that, because if voters are encouraged to do that, we may get higher exhaust rates than otherwise, and these may be distributed unevenly between different parties." End quote. This amendment from Senator Day and my amendment that is substantively the same delivers on what Professor Williams and Dr Bonham recommended. If the Liberals, National Greens coalition do not support this amendment, it would demonstrate that the one public hearing inquiry into this bill was a complete farce, and that the expert witnesses who appeared shouldn't have bothered. It would demonstrate that the Liberal National Greens coalition care nothing about votes being exhausted. Let me remind the Senate what vote exhaustion means. It means that if you didn't write in numbers on the ballot paper for the parties vying for the last Senate spot, then you have no say in determining which of those parties wins that last Senate spot. This phenomenon is a feature of optional preferential voting and would be particularly prevalent if just one voting took hold. I note that the current directors of the Liberal and National parties provided testimony to the one hearing of the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, stating that they intend to recommend that people vote 1 to 6. But these comments do not bind the Liberal and National parties now or in the future, and other parties also appear to have the option of pursuing just one vote how-to-vote cards if they wish. As such, this amendment is necessary to ensure we do not descend into a just vote one electoral system.
Senator Collins.
Thank you, Chair. The opposition is pleased to support Senator Day's amendments. Senator Day's amendments introduce two new criminal offence provisions in relation to advocating the casting of informal votes. The first amendment is section 328C, which makes it an offence to distribute a how-to-vote card that is likely to mislead or deceive a voter in relation to marking a Senate ballot paper in a way that is informal. The second amendment to section 328D, which makes it an offence to offence to publicly advocate for voters to mark a Senate ballot paper in a way that is informal. These amendments echo the previous section 329A of the Electoral Act, which was repealed, as we discussed earlier, in the late 1990s. But what we discussed earlier, of course, was that the mischief was disposed of at the same time. These provisions are obviously introducing new mischief that needs to be addressed, and I don't believe that the minister in his responses today has given satisfactory assurances that the existing provisions will be able to manage that mischief. Now, Senator Day has explained his amendments far more articulately and efficiently than I can at this hour. Senator Day's performance stands in stark contrast to the level of information that has been provided to some critical issues in this debate. Despite hours of questioning from various senators, the minister has not been able to answer a simple question as to whether the government's bill would make it unlawful for a person to advocate to simply vote one above the line in the Senate. I think Senator Lambie's experience there was perhaps the most stark. Senator Day understands that nothing about the Government Greens bill will prevent a person advocating such a vote, and he has quite sensibly moved an amendment to deal with that matter. Labor supports Senator Day's intentions and accordingly will support this amendment. If this amendment fails, we also note, as Senator Lynham has indicated, his similar amendment, and we would support that as well.
So the question is that amendment number 1 on sheet 7886. Sorry. The question is that amendment number 1 on sheet 7890 be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Against say no. I think the noes have it. Division required. Ring the bells. Lock the doors. The question is that amendment number 1 on sheet 7890 be agreed to. Those of that opinion say the ayes will move to the right of the chair, the noes to the left of the chair. I appoint Senator Urquhart teller for the ayes and Senator Smith teller for the noes. Order. There being 21 ayes and 34 noes, the question is resolved in the negative. The negative. Senator Lionhelm.
Thank you, Chair. I withdraw amendment on 7886.
Thank you, Senator Lionhelm.
And I move amendment 7868, standing in my name.
Amendment 1 on sheet 7868.
Amendment 1, sorry, yep. Yes, 7868. Existing electoral law allows candidates from different parties to appear in the same column on the ballot, and for the names of each of these parties to be printed in that column above the line. There could be 2, 3, 4 or more parties that wish to share a column under this provision. The government's bill allows for party logos to also be printed above the line. However, it does not allow for the logo of each party in a column to be printed above the line. It only allows for 2 logos to be printed in a column above the line. Now, by sheer coincidence, I'm sure, this assists the Liberal National Coalition. They have regularly used the existing provision to have their candidates appear in the same column. Now each of their logos will appear in that column above the line. This will make the Liberal National Coalition more prominent on the ballot compared to their rivals, like the Labor Party. I'm surprised the government didn't go further and require that the logos of the Liberals and the Nationals should appear in colour, while everyone else's logo must be in black and white. However, in the preparation of the government's bills, there has been an oversight, and because I want to help the government, my amendment addresses this oversight. After all, we crossbenchers are here to help. It appears that the drafters of the government's bill didn't realise the potential for a Liberal, Nationals, Greens coalition in the coming election and into the future. Because Senator Di Natale is a doctor and owns a farm, it seems he is welcome in the same column as the Liberals' Senator James Paterson and the Nationals' Senator Bridget McKenzie. So, to continue to assist those in power, Australia's electoral law should allow the logo of the Liberals, the logo of the Nationals and the logo of the Greens to each appear in the one column. Every voter's eyes would be drawn to such a sight. Even if the Liberals, the Nationals and the Greens can't see the potential for this coalition to be formalised in the coming weeks, surely they can see the potential for it over the coming years. So my amendment would allow for up to 3 logos to be printed in a column above the line. If the Liberals, Nationals and Greens do not support this amendment, they owe it to the Australian people to explain why. What is the principle behind allowing 2 logos in a column and not just 1, or allowing 3? Isn't it reminiscent of Robert Mugabe to amend electoral law with such brazen self-interest?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, the government does not accept that closing assertion that Senator Lynham has made. The provision to allow parties at their discretion to include a logo in the relevant spot on the ballot paper is in order to avoid voter confusion between parties of similar names, and I suspect that Senator Lynham might remember an instance where there was a level of confusion between parties of a similar name which might have created some benefit for him in the state of New South Wales. Now, in relation, the reason we are opposed to this amendment is that, as it is currently written, the bill allows for up to 2 logos to be printed adjacent to the square that is printed on the ballot paper, where that group is endorsed by more than one political party. Having up to 2 logos on ballot papers will give voters sufficient opportunity to identify who they are voting for without cluttering the ballot paper and creating voter confusion. Going beyond 2 logos, which must be of uniform size, could create a situation where the ballot paper becomes, again, unnecessarily large and complex. The AEC has advised that since 2007, there have been no instances of 3 or more parties running as part of the same registered group in a federal election, which suggests that this amendment is clearly not necessary in practice. But of course, we all understand the somewhat humorous political point that Senator Lynham sought to make.
Senator Collins.
Thank you, Chair, and let me share with Senator Cormann the light relief of the humour at this stage in the consideration. It was possibly helpful, but I think, well, I'll indicate the opposition's position here, but then I'll go on to some of the concerns that were canvassed earlier in general discussion. The opposition will not be supporting these amendments. These amendments relate to the party logos being printed on ballot papers. The idea of having party logos printed on ballot papers appears to have been a thought bubble. Not sure how it arose between the government and the Greens in their discussions, but certainly the policy rationale and how any issues and concerns that JSCM had previously raised were addressed came to the 2016 JSCM investigation in some way of osmosis. Now, I've asked these questions earlier, and Senator Cormann referred to some elements of the explanatory memorandum talking about the copyright issues in terms of there being a copyright matter between 2 political parties, but we are still at a loss as to how the AEC is going to execute this function. How will the AEC necessarily know if there's a copyright issue? It's not within the AEC's current purview to understand these types of copyright matters. How is it proposed that they will be addressed? Now, we have point 4.2 in the majority committee members' report, this statement that the committee is pleased that these issues that the earlier JSCM inquiry had raised have been addressed to the government's satisfaction. The problem is that we've had no description of what these issues are and how indeed they have been addressed. The point made at 4.19 on party logos in the 2016 committee's report highlights that when JSCM previously considered this issue, it was reluctant to recommend for the inclusion of party logos on ballot papers without having an opportunity to assess the associated copyright and printing ramifications. Now that point's made, but the very next point is just simply the committee is pleased that these issues have been addressed to the government's satisfaction. Well, you might assume that they have if they've been put in the bill, but there's certainly been no competent description about how those matters have been addressed. Simply points in the explanatory memorandum that somehow, in ways we're yet to understand, the AEC will adopt a new role assessing copyright matters. But the other issues about printing ramifications, sure, we've had references to how we'll proceed with black and white, and so that wonderful Greens logo is now going to adopt a skivvy and become black. But beyond that, the description of what the issues are here and how they have arisen through this deal are certainly lacking at this point. But at the moment we are addressing Senator Leyonhjelm's amendments, and what I'll say here, similar to the point that I just made about this overall proposal, is that we are not satisfied that this idea has been subject to any proper analysis. Senator Leyonhjelm's concerns are worthy of consideration, but without that analysis, Labor cannot support this amendment on this occasion.
The question is that amendment number 1 on sheet 7868 be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Against say no. I think the noes have it. The noes have it. Senator Rhiannon, did you seek to ask a question at this point?
Yes, I had a question
Senator
of the Minister. Thank you, Chair. Minister, do the sections of this bill concerning registered officers, and I'm referring to subsections 1262B and 1262C, allow a person to be the registered officer of a political party registered with the AEC and the registered officer or deputy registered officer of a state branch of that political party where the branch is also a party registered with the AEC?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Chair. Consistent with the JSCAM's recommendations, the bill proposes changes to remove ambiguity around the accountabilities, affiliations and alliances of political parties by removing the capacity for an individual to be a registered officer or deputy registered officer of multiple political parties. This does not prevent a person from being the registered officer of the same federal political party and the registered officer of a state branch or division of that party, and indeed the relevant provision that ensures that is the place, and that is certainly the intention, is on page 16 of the bill, clause 52(2)(c) small b.
Senator Rhiannon.
The last part of my question was, and this is with regard to state branch, where the state branch, where the registered officer or deputy registered officer of a state branch of that political party, where the branch is also a party registered with the AEC. So it's not just about the state branches, because some state branches are registered with the AEC, and it concerns different parties, as I'm aware.
Minister.
Well, I mean, this question obviously has been raised with us some time ago, and the advice that I received at the time is that subsection 2b, which prevents a person from being a registered officer of several different parties, does not prevent a person from being both the registered officer or deputy registered officer of a registered political party for the purposes of this Act, and the registered officer or deputy registered officer, however described, for the purposes of an Act of a state or territory or an ordinance of an external territory of a political party or a branch of a political party.
Senator Leyonhjelm.
Thank you, Chair. I move Amendment 7867, standing in my name.
Amendment 1 on sheet.
Amendment 1,
Yeah,
sorry.
thank you. Yes, thanks.
Chair, you have the right to remain silent, but a government violates your rights if it forces you to be silent by putting gaffer tape over your mouth. You have a right to privacy, but a government violates your rights if it forces you to be private by locking you in a padded cell. And you have a right to vote, but a government violates your rights if it forces you to vote by making non-enrolment and non-voting an offence. My amendment makes enrolment and voting voluntary. Forcing people to vote when they are dissatisfied with the options available is a practice straight out of the authoritarian handbook, and this bill's changes to Senate voting rules will discourage new parties from forming, such that voters will have even less choice in the future than now. It is unconscionable that when the options available to Australians are effectively reduced to Liberal National Green Coalition or Labor, Australians are not given the option of none of the above. I commend my amendment to the Senate.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. The government does not support this amendment. The government has absolutely no plan to change the current system of enrolment and compulsory voting in Australia. Compulsory voting at federal elections was introduced in 1912 and has ensured that Australia has some of the highest civic participation rates in the world, with voter turnout of over 93% at the 2013 election.
Senator Collins.
Thank you, Chair. It won't surprise Senator Leyonhjelm that the opposition will not support this amendment, which proposes voluntary voting, as per the earlier discussion even about where this deal takes us in relation to people being required to indicate a vote with respect to the total number of candidates. I have already indicated to Senator Cormann I look forward to reviewing the Hansard of the earlier philosophical discussion about whether people should have a right not to have to vote for particular micro-parties if they don't want to, which, as I argued at the time, seems to be taking us down that path. Now, Australians live in a great democracy. As Winston Churchill reminded us, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. Democracy grants citizens many privileges, but those privileges, and my innate response to Senator Leyonhjelm before, is those privileges are balanced with important civic responsibilities. In Australia, you are expected to get up and go to work, get the kids off to school, pay your taxes and meet your responsibilities to the community. Perhaps the greatest of these responsibilities is to play a role in our democracy by turning up to hold the government to account on election day. In a democracy, the people act as the bulwark against maladministration, corruption and even tyranny. Compulsory voting plays a vital role in our democracy by reminding the Australian people that in exchange for the many privileges that come with living in our country, you are expected to meet your constitutional duties as a citizen. Compulsory voting also grounds Australian politics in the sensible centre and has helped us to avoid some of the distasteful, hyper-partisan politics that we have seen in some other countries. The Australian Labor Party strongly supports compulsory voting, as I have previously indicated, and therefore we cannot support Senator Leyonhjelm's amendments.
Senator Rhiannon.
Free voting is certainly a foundation of our voting system, something that is to be proud of and something that is very critical to encouraging people to involve themselves with all aspects of our democratic system. And considering there is a big election brewing on the other side of our planet, I would argue that it's a better system where parties spend time persuading voters to vote for them on policy issues than just spending time encouraging them to get out to vote.
The question is that amendment number 1 on sheet 7867 be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Against say no. I think the noes have it. The noes have it. Senator Leyonhjelm.
Thank you, Chair. I move amendment 1 on sheet 7853, standing in my name. This amendment introduces optional preferential voting for the House of Representatives. It replicates the provisions in the government's bill relating to above-the-line voting in the Senate. As such, when voters vote, in a House of Representatives election, they will be instructed to write at least the numbers 1 to 6 or less if there are fewer candidates, but votes marked with just a 1, tick or cross will still be considered formal. This will make the voting task for the House of Representatives the same as when voting above the line for the Senate. It will also generate a similar degree of vote exhaustion. Those voters who fill in fewer squares than 6 or the number of candidates will end up having no say if the last 2 candidates vying for election aren't in the voters' top 6 or fewer. I note that this effect of optional preferential voting particularly disenfranchises supporters of minor parties, because their top 6 are less likely to include the candidates who are the last candidates standing in the battle for the vacancy. The Liberal National Green coalition clearly do not care about vote exhaustion, so I expect it to support my amendment. In fact, this is the only coherent path for the Liberal National Green coalition to follow. If the coalition does not support my amendment, the Australian public deserve an explanation. Why is optional preferential voting good for the Senate but not for the House of Representatives? I would particularly like the coalition to allay my fear that we're getting optional preferential voting in the Senate because this would help both the Liberals and the Greens, but we're not getting optional preferential voting in the House of Representatives because this would hurt the Greens, who rely on people expressing their second, third or fourth preference in order to get elected. I fear this entire reform has nothing to do with principle and everything to do with entrenching incumbents.
Minister.
The government will be opposing these amendments, and let me just say right up front that our Senate voting reforms have got everything to do with principle, and it has got everything to do with the principle that the result at a Senate election should reflect the will of the Australian people. The government has, of course, in putting together these reforms, based our reforms on the recommendations, the unanimous recommendations of the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, which inquired into the conduct of the last election. The Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters focused its voting reform recommendations on Senate voting and did not identify any problems that required changes to the method of voting for the House of Representatives.
Senator Collins.
Thank you, Chair. The opposition will not support these amendments. I've already outlined our in-principle opposition to optional preferential voting. Consistent with that position, we will not support the amendments. And can I take this opportunity, though, because I've made similar remarks with respect to Senator Day and Senator Muir, I would like to acknowledge Senator Lionhelm and indeed other members of the crossbench for the way in which they have engaged with this legislation in good faith and during this committee stage process, with amendments again seeking to highlight in what has been a very inadequate process some of the significant issues and problems with the proposals as they stand.
Senator Rhiannon.
Thank you, Chair. The Greens will not support these amendments. You could call them Senator Lenholm's Trojan horse trying to get OPV into the House of Representatives. Again, the House of Representatives system of full preferential voting is a very important part of how we elect the House of Representatives, and that should remain as it is. Thank you.
The question is that amendment number 1 on sheet 7853 be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Against say no. I think the noes have it. Division required. Ring the bells. Lock the doors. The question is that amendment number 1 on sheet 7853 be agreed to. The ayes will move to the right of the chair, the noes to the left of the chair. I appoint Senator Lionhelm teller for the ayes and Senator McEwen teller for the noes. Order. There being 5 ayes and 45 noes, the question is resolved in the negative. Senator Lionhelm.
Thank you, Chair. I move Amendment 1 on sheet 7866, standing in my name. This amendment reduces Senate election funding per vote by a quarter and removes the requirement in the Senate to receive 4% of first preference votes in order to receive funding. The amendment leaves funding arrangements for House of Representatives elections untouched. Removing the 4% barrier will remove baseless discrimination against minor parties and minor party voters. It is unconscionable that major parties get a couple of dollars per vote but minor parties do not. This is the antithesis of one vote, one value. The Liberal National Greens coalition say that attacking minor parties is not the purpose of their bill. If this is the case, they will take this opportunity to remove the 4% barrier. At the very least, they will explain why the 4% barrier should be retained. I can see no principled nor practical reason for this 4% barrier. My amendment reduces Senate election funding per vote to ensure that the removal of the 4% barrier does not increase the burden on taxpayers to fund party political election campaigning. I commend my amendment to the Senate.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. The government will be opposing this amendment. This amendment will provide electoral funding to any group of Senate candidates who receive votes at an election and removes the 4% first preferences threshold that is currently required to be met before receiving public funding. It would also provide different levels of funding between candidates for the House of Representatives and the Senate, creating a potentially discriminatory disparity that does not currently exist. It is not justifiable that minor parties who spend little or no money on elections should profit simply by nominating a group for the Senate and not reaching the 4% funding threshold. Indeed, we don't want to provide an additional perverse incentive for people to nominate at a Senate election for the sole purpose of generating some public funding support. The government will not be supporting this amendment.
Senator Collins.
You, Mr Deputy President. The opposition will not support these amendments. Public funding of elections and political parties is in the public interest because it helps to reduce the influence of private political donations in the electoral process. The Australian Labor Party has a clear, consistent commitment to enhancing transparency and accountability in relation to political donations. I have already referred to the mischaracterisations of the deal between the Labor government and the Australian Greens, who, to borrow a phrase from Senator Sims and Senator Di Natale, every vote, every parliament, every time. Now, the Greens Party also claim to be committed to reforming political donations, in particular their supposedly pure as driven snow democracy spokesperson. But while she can walk the walk, we're not seeing that she can talk the talk in the discussion to date. Senator Rhiannon will have the opportunity to put her money where her mouth is when Labor moves amendments to give effect to our shared commitment to political donations reform during the later stages of this debate. But the Australian Greens have already sold out their commitment to marriage equality, to put it on hold until their deal with the Liberals on Senate voting reform can occur. I'm going to be curious to see how Senator Rhiannon responds to her commitment on political donations reform. This will be addressed with further amendments, but I digress. The public funding of political parties and elections plays an important role in our democracy. Labor is always willing to look at how the system may be improved, but that should not occur in a rushed or truncated fashion. Absent a proper JSCAM or an alternative process, given recent limitations with JSCAM, absent a proper process with an opportunity for submissions from all stakeholders, Labor believes it would be imprudent to alter the current arrangements, and accordingly we cannot support Senator Leyonhjelm's amendments at this time.
Question is that amendment number 1 on sheet 7866 be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Against say no. I think the noes have it. The noes have it. Senator Muir.
Thank you, Chair. I move Amendment 2 on sheet 7873. Thank you, Chair. This amendment is in relation to penalties for those who encourage an informal vote. We've had substantive debate about this throughout the night, and considering that we established last night that with the savings provision, or that the saving provision will make section 329 redundant because the because of vote 1 above the line is not informal, I realise that this has been pretty heavily debated. I'm still going to move the amendment though, because I think if we can prove that, or if it can be proved that somebody's deliberately encouraged an informal vote, that there should be penalties in place, and it should be a lot stronger than it is. $5,000 for a political party is like a parking fine. And we did consider new offences. I did consider new offences, but have discovered that this might actually create some constitutional issues. So I've decided to simply increase the penalties for those who encourage informal voting.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Chair. The government does not support this amendment for the reasons previously outlined.
Senator Collins.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. The opposition will not be supporting these amendments. Labor is open to increasing the penalties for electoral offences. In fact, we will be moving amendments of our own to achieve this outcome. However, we believe that any increases must be the product of careful analysis and consideration. And I suppose, can I make that point about JSCAM again? Because the process that has occurred in relation to this bill has much broader implication, which has been highlighted on at least 2, 3, 4 occasions during the consideration of other proposals that have been put forward in amendments. And each time I get to indicate that JSCEM might be the appropriate body to look further at those suggestions, of course I now need to pause. And I need to pause because of the way the governments and the Greens used what had previously been a bipartisan approach to electoral matters to further this deal. That is the difficulty of what has occurred for the consideration of this legislation. That is the difficulty with the Greens attending the committee inquiry and voting with the government to block even the department appearing before that inquiry. And the implications, though, go well beyond this bill. The implications go to the principles of transparency and accountability across the parliament. So each time I say that, for instance, on this occasion, Senator Muir is making a worthwhile proposal that warrants further consideration, we now need to contemplate where such consideration might best occur, whereas previously it would have gone to JSCEM without question. Now, the increases proposed by Labor are drawn from the legislation we introduced in government, which was blocked by the Coalition. These penalty increases were the product of expert advice from the public service and through consultation and parliamentary scrutiny. Labor believes, therefore, that our proposals are more solid and we will prefer our own amendments to those of Senator Muir. But that said, I would like to acknowledge his genuine interest and engagement in this process.
Senator Rhiannon.
Yeah, there is part of the Greens overall do not support these amendments. I did want to comment on the aspect about misleading statements. It does actually address something that is very important that the Greens have given our support to for a long time, what we've called truth in advertising. But the provision does need more consideration. I think that could be undertaken by JSCEM, because we need more far-reaching reform to prevent misleading statements in election campaigns. I know there's great complexity in this area because we've tried to work on it. Then it takes up the issue of a 6-year sunset clause on voting reforms. Clearly, we would not support that. It would effectively kill off the bill, kill off the legislation fairly quickly. And then there is the exclusion zone. Exclusion zones around polling booths might sound attractive, but really election day is a good test of the level of support in the community a party has. It's one day where there is a more equal playing field for all candidates and all parties, that you mobilise your support, you get out there, you prosecute your involvement with the community, and it really is, again, an excellent part of our democratic process. So overall, we cannot support these amendments.
The question is that amendment number 2 on sheet 7873 be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Against say no. I think the noes have it. The noes have it. Senator Collins.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr Deputy President. I move the opposition amendments on sheet 7854. This amendment will reduce the threshold at which political donations must be disclosed from the current figure of $13,000 to $1,000. The Labor Party believes that political donations should be transparent and that parties should be accountable for the donations they receive. This is part of our commitment to improving transparency and accountability in the system of political donations generally. This is good for democracy. Prior to 2006, the donation disclosure threshold was $1,000. In a cynical move, John Howard dramatically increased the threshold to $10,000 and then pegged it to inflation. So the figure is now $13,000. Labor's policy is to return the threshold to $1,000, because we believe transparency in political donations is good for democracy. Our concern with this issue, and why we raise it in this context, is we find it difficult to imagine why, when the government was keen to deal on electoral reform, they weren't pegged on donations. We don't understand why the Greens have not taken the opportunity to respond on this important policy issue when they had that opportunity with the government. They've certainly complained when we were not able to progress it further due to the then opposition's intransience. They had that opportunity to challenge it on this occasion, but seem to have played lame.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, the government will oppose this amendment because, in the government's judgment, the current donation threshold arrangements reflect the appropriate balance between transparency and enabling Australians to participate in the political process. And where there is a donation over the threshold, it is required to be disclosed to the Australian Electoral Commission by both the donor and the recipient. The government believes that it is important that all political parties, associated entities and donors follow the appropriate federal and or state disclosure laws. Commonwealth Funding and Disclosure Scheme is administered by the AEC, an independent statutory authority. The scheme requires candidates, political parties, associated entities and donors in the electoral process to lodge financial disclosure returns with the AEC. These financial disclosure returns must be lodged by 20 October each year and are published on the AEC website on the first working day in February of the following year. The annual returns from political parties, donors and associated entities are all publicly available on the Australian Electoral Commission website. If Labor were serious about donation reform, they would have made changes when they were in government. And indeed, I mean, I'm advised that as part of their agreement with the Greens to form government in 2010, that they actually promised to the Greens party at the time not only to pursue Senate electoral reform, but also to pursue reforms to the campaign donation arrangements, including the donation disclosure threshold. And I mean, Senator Collins said something really confusing just now. She said that the reason Labor did not pursue these changes that they apparently support was because of opposition by the coalition. Well, hello. I mean, the Labor Party actually had the numbers in the Senate with the Greens. So the Labor Party signed an agreement to form government with the Australian Greens. I mean, we all remember the photo. I'm not sure whether Senator Di Natale was on the picture opportunity. No, that was before his time. But I remember the photo. I think that Senator Bob Brown was still around, and he had a big grin. And I mean, you know, it was actually quite an occasion. It was quite a significant occasion. And at that time, Labor promised to the Australian Greens two things that are directly relevant to what we are talking about here. They promised to the Australian Greens that a Gillard Labor government would pursue a Senate electoral reform, and of course it was immediately put into the too hard basket after the Greens had delivered what the Gillard government needed. It was immediately put into the too hard basket. And the other thing that the Gillard Labor government promised to the Greens, as I understand it, is to pursue relevant reforms that both Labor and the Greens apparently supported at the time in relation to donation disclosure thresholds and related matters. Now, there is absolutely no excuse for Senator Collins to come in here and say that the only reason that Labor in government, over 6 years in government, didn't do it is because of the coalition. We did not have the numbers in the Senate. In 2010, we did not have the numbers in the Senate. Well, hang on. Now, the agreement between then Prime Minister Gillard and then Greens leader Bob Brown was actually signed in 2010. When I last looked, Ms. Gillard became Prime Minister of Australia in June 2010, and that the election was in August 2010, and that the agreement with the Greens was signed in September 2010. And indeed, I mean, what you did do is that on the 17th of November 2010, you passed the relevant law which you had agreed with the Greens through the House of Representatives. You passed it on the 17th of November, the Commonwealth Electoral Amendment, Political Donations and Other Measures Bill 2010. But that is where it stayed, that is where it's stranded, that is where it was left stranded. You never brought it to the Senate, even though if you wanted to, you had the capacity to move it through the Senate much more efficiently than we are able to move anything through the Senate, because, I mean, in one week you guillotined 136 bills through the Senate. I mean, Senator Cash, Senator Fifield, a number of us were actually here at the time. A number of us weren't here, but Senator Fifield, Senator Cash and I were here. And, I mean, indeed, I mean, there were a whole bunch of bills where we didn't even get to say as much as one word. I mean, all we got to do was perhaps to raise a point of order. So, I mean, for Senator Collins to come in here and try to suggest that the reason why, after making the promise to the Greens in September 2010, they didn't pursue the Commonwealth Electoral Amendment, Political Donations and Other Measures Bill was because of us, is just completely deceptive, it is completely misleading, it is completely inaccurate. If Labor had wanted to do it at the time, they could have done it. And of course, I mean, it's very transparent as to why this is being put on the table here. It's very transparent. There is one reason, and one reason only, why Labor is moving these amendments. They're trying to make things as uncomfortable as possible for the Australian Greens to support this historic and this very important reform of the Senate electoral system. Some people in the Labor Party are desperate to ensure that the power to direct preferences, the power to trade and direct preferences, remains with backroom operators in political parties. There are some people in the Labor Party, and most of them here in the Senate, who just can't fathom, who can't accept that what we should be doing is to empower the Australian people to determine what happens to their preferences. There are some people in the Labor Party who just can't fathom that the result at future Senate elections should truly reflect the will of the Australian people. I mean, during this debate earlier today, Senator Collins made this very strange observation. Her key complaint against the reforms that we're putting forward is that a party that attracts more votes ends up with more seats. So the key complaint that Senator Collins actually directed at the reforms put forward by the coalition government in relation to Senate electoral voting arrangements is that a party that attracts more votes ends up with more seats. Well, I mean, we think that that is the way democracy is actually meant to work. This is a transparent stunt, and the government is not going to support these amendments.
Senator Denatali.
Chair, look, I won't make a long contribution. I don't want to make this any more acrimonious than the debate has already been over the past more than 24 hours that I think we've been at this now. We support the intent of this specific amendment. We certainly support the intent of the amendment. We need to also recognise this is a very different piece of legislation from the changes to Senate voting reform. This is an issue around campaign finance reform as opposed to the method in which people are elected to the Senate, and that's why the Greens have separate legislation to deal with this issue. We have separate legislation in the form of a bill which has now been sent to an inquiry. So while we support the intent of the amendments, we have those amendments now before an inquiry. And I think when you're talking about an amendment that is so substantively different from the content of a piece of legislation like the one we're debating at the moment, which is the method in which we elect senators to the parliament, then of course it warrants a much more detailed look. And I suppose if the Labor Party is to be consistent, because their primary criticism has been that this issue hasn't been subjected to enough scrutiny, something that we reject, but if they're going to be consistent, then obviously they'd want these significant amendments to be the subject of an inquiry, because this is very different, a different proposal to the one that we're debating at the moment. So we look forward to their support once that bill is subjected to an inquiry, and we look forward to ensuring some cooperation when we put that specific piece of legislation to the parliament. I hope, although I suspect that it's a forlorn hope, that this isn't just another tactic in the same way as the issue, which I have to say is to the great shame of all of us in this place. Let's be frank about it. The way this debate will have been received by the Australian community is with, I think, a great deal of disgust and contempt for the work that's gone on here over the past week. And it is disappointing that issues like campaign finance reform and political donation reform, both of which are really important issues that the Greens have a long history on. I mean, Lee Rhiannon has been championing this reform for over a decade. She has, both in the New South Wales Parliament and in the federal Parliament, the campaign that she's been running on democracy for sale, the websites and so on, introducing the opportunity for people to assess what corporate donors are funding political parties and to what amount. I think that's all been terrific, and so we're keen to progress this issue. But as I said, it's through an inquiry. Senator Cormann is absolutely right. He's absolutely right. This was the subject of the agreement between the Labor Party and the Greens in 2010. It is hugely disappointing that when we did have the opportunity, with the Labor Party governing and having our support in the Senate, not just our support, but making this a condition of the agreement with the Labor Party, that they didn't bring this on for a vote. Because if this had have been brought on for a vote back in 2010, we wouldn't be having this discussion right now. What we'd see is an improvement to our political donation laws. So we have a number of amendments here. I won't speak to each of them individually, just to say that we certainly support the intent of each of those amendments. And this is now subject to an inquiry. We hope it's just not another tactic, in the same way that marriage equality has been used as a bit of a political football in this place. We hope that we can work cooperatively beyond today's sitting to ensure that we do see what is really important reform that we know the Australian community are desperate for.
Senator Collins.
Yeah, I'm allowed to make another contribution, except I do need to respond to the rewriting of history that has just occurred from both Senator Cormann. Senator Di Natale may not have been a participant at this stage, but what needs to be set out is when the Labor Party sought to deal with political donations, we sought to do it in an across-parliament fashion. We sought to reach arrangements, and indeed we made compromises with the Abbott government. These are the arrangements that the Abbott government retreated from. This was one of Tony Abbott's first broken promises. But this is indeed our criticism of this current process. We have said from the outset, and we have said in terms of the operations of JSCEM, you can't progress important matters such as electoral reform or the reform of political donations in a partisan, backroom, closed-door deal type fashion. That was the problem with political donations. That was the problem with what's occurred here. The consistent theme in that is the government and the government's behaviour in managing those issues. And rewriting history is not going to change any of that.
Senator Cameron.
Thank you, Chair. Now, I don't know if anyone noticed, but after 20-odd hours in this place, Senator Cormann moved so quickly to get to his feet on the issue of corporate donations that you'd have thought somebody had stuck a cattle prod up under his seat. He was up like a jack-in-the-box, because the Liberals don't want this issue debated in any transparent way. The Liberals are the worst of the worst when it comes to the rip-offs in electoral donations. And I'll come back to the Liberals in a minute. Just let me deal with the Greens' contribution from Senator Di Natale. You know, he indicated that Senator Rhiannon had been doing this for a long time. Well, Senator Rhiannon, you've got an opportunity now, through the chair, you've got an opportunity now to get up and agree with us and deal with this issue now. And deal with this issue now. And I just draw the Chamber's attention to a notice a notice under Order 75 that was given by the Greens, by Senator Rachel Seward, on the 24th of February. And it says this: "Pursuant to Standing Order 75, I give notice that today I propose to move that, in the opinion of the Senate, the following is a matter of urgency." And I quote, "The need for immediate action on political donation reform to address the corrupting influence of political donations, including from property developers and fossil fuel companies. Yours sincerely, Senator Rachel Seward." This was on the 24th of February. And on the 24th of February, we didn't hear any of the waffle that we had from Senator Di Natale about, this is about campaign finance reform. We need to think this through carefully. On the 24th of February, they were demanding immediate action. They're all stunts, this mob. They're all stunts and no action. Another stunt from the Greens on this issue. They want to talk about all the issues, but when they get an opportunity to do something about it, they don't do it. They had an opportunity on marriage equality, they squibbed that. They've got an opportunity on campaign financing, they squibbed that. They had an opportunity to kill off a double dissolution, and they squibbed that. They are an absolute pathetic mob that really only think about themselves and think about nothing else. Here they are, they're talking that they need an inquiry, or we're doing an inquiry, so we can't deal with it. But on the 24th of February, there was a need for immediate action. You can't trust a word that comes out of Senator Di Natale's mouth. Cannot trust a word that comes out of his mouth. So we know they've done a dirty deal with the Liberals. And they've crossed the floor so many times with the Liberals in the last 24 hours that I've lost count. But they're in a deal with the Liberals. They just talk big and they do nothing. They really are a do-nothing mob. I want to get back to the Liberals. And as I said earlier, you saw the Libs up on their feet. Senator Cormann up on his feet so quickly. And the reason he's up on his feet so quickly is that they've got one of their former key players, one of the insiders in the Liberal Party, the former director of the Victorian and Tasmanian divisions of the Liberal Party, Damien Mantash, pleaded guilty to a $1.5 million fraud against the Victorian division of the party. Now, this was the guy who was sacked by the Tasmanian division of the party because he stole tens of thousands of dollars through the illegitimate charges to his corporate credit card. And it all occurred under Senator Betsy's watch. Now, this is the guy who's looking after the money for the Tasmanian and Victorian Liberal Party. There is so much money sloshing around in the Liberal Party, donations from banks, donations from finance companies, donations from developers, donations from the big end of town, that they don't know how much money they've got. They didn't even know that $1.5 million was gone from their own accounts in both Victoria and in Tasmania. The money is just pouring in. And if you look at some of the headlines recently, politics hidden millions in party favours. Priority access to the Nationals federal government team, 75 grand, and you get access to Barnett's set to Mr Joyce. What a dream that would be. Stuart Robert and political donations. Now, Mr Stuart Robert, an MP in the lower house, under investigation by the Australian Financial Police, the Australian Federal Police. Sydney Morning Herald going back to June 30th, 2015. Key Liberal fundraising body took mafia money for access. Mafia money for access. Back in February the 14th, donation disclosure reveals murky deal for country Liberals. Another one, illegal donations from developers fund New South Wales Libs win. You know, this is just about money in trust funds, in associated entities, in the Liberal Party. And if you ever want to know why the Liberal Party are doing something in this place, go on the money trail. Find out where the money is. And if they're doing a deal for the banks, you know the banks are giving them money. If they're doing a deal for the finance sector's giving them money. They don't want to look after ordinary families trying to get into the housing market because the housing market is distorted to the investors. Then look where the money's coming from, the white shoe brigade of the property developers. That's what this mob is about. They are absolutely pathetic when it comes to this issue. And I can go through all the associated entities of, well, I can't go through them all, I can go through some of them, where they are not properly telling where the money's coming from. Hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars going into the National Party and the Liberal Party coffers so that they can run election campaigns. And all they do is take the money, and then what happens? They are doing favours for the people that are making the donations. Who gets the priority access to the government? Who gets priority access to the Liberals? Who gets priority access to the Nationals? Those that are putting the money into their donations. And you cannot find out where the donations have come from because they're hidden in a web of associated entities that you cannot crack the code. So much money that $1.5 million can be stolen, and they didn't even know it was happening. Did not even know it was happening. The Platinum Forum in Victoria, they received over $1 million, but no donations over 12,000 were declared. All hidden, all hidden. Paraquila Proprietary Limited, the former director of the Liberal Party, Brian Loughnane, is the director, 932,000, but only declared ATO receipts of $43,000. The Liberal Club in Western Australia, $830,000 in receipts and only $48,000 in declared donations. I can go on and on and on. It's an absolute rot. If there was ever a need for a royal commission, it's a royal commission into the associated entities of the Liberal Party, because we've heard a lot of discussion, a lot of debate about democracy. Well, this is what's killing democracy in this country. The donations that are flooding in to the coalition, the donations that are not properly accounted for, the donations that mean that if the big end of town saying you shouldn't do this, or you can't look after ordinary people in this country, you look at where the money's coming from, and that's what's driving the policy decisions of the Liberal National Party. It is an absolutely outrageous disgrace, an absolute disgrace. So these are the donations that are coming in. Mafia money. So much money that they don't even know it's being stolen. They are absolutely outrageous. I don't know where it ends, but I can tell you every time there's a policy which is defending the rich and powerful in this country, that policy comes from the other side of this chamber, and it's because the money's getting put in, and they are delivering for the people that are paying the money in to their coffers. They attack the trade union movement, they attack pensioners, they attack families by trying to put a $7 co-payment on health care. They are prepared to attack the working class in this country, the poorest people in this country. If you've got a kid out of work, Senator Cormann in his 2014-15 budget said they should get no money. They should get nothing, no support, no assistance for 6 months. What an outrageous proposition. Starving young people in this country because of their ideology, because that's what the extreme right wing of the Liberal Party say should happen. And I don't accept for 1 minute that we should ignore this. We should not ignore this. These people are taking money from big business, taking money from the finance sector, taking money from the banking sector, so much money they don't know where it is, they don't know what to do with it, and they are hiding it. If ever a royal commission was needed, it's a royal commission into the National and Liberal parties' associated entities.
Senator Rhiannon.
The Labor have 4 amendments, very similar to the one that they've just moved, about linking political donations with the legislation that we have before us. As Senator Richard Di Natale has set out, we clearly support the intent of the amendments. And very happy to acknowledge the interjection from Senator Wong to show, because it reveals what their tactics are here. Their tactics here, it's not actually about, and happy to acknowledge that too, that the intent here is not about political donations coming from Labor. And why we know that is because we look at their track record when absolutely the same reforms came before Labor and they didn't act. And we'll go through that. This needs to be put on the record. The dots need to be joined here. Why are they bringing on it now? It's another one of their wedges. We've talked about the other wedges. No, not embarrassed at all. Not embarrassed at all.
Senator Rhiannon, one moment, please. Senator Cameron, you've just had your chance, and Senator Rhiannon listened quietly throughout your speech. Senators have the right to be heard in silence. Thank you, Senator Rhiannon.
Thank you, Chair. I'm certainly not embarrassed. It's a good opportunity to get this on the record. And I think the place to start is with a statement that Senator Cameron made in this speech and he's made in other speeches, where he makes the big flurry about how it's the Liberals who take the big donations. And it's disappointing that he's leaving at this point, because he really does need to understand that he's made a very fundamental mistake here. And I would just like to share with you the data from the Australian Electoral Commission for 2003 to 2004 returns. So do I remind you again, Senator Cameron has made out that it's always the Liberals who get much bigger donations than Labor. Now, I'm just going to give the data for 1 year, but if you look at the trend since this information became publicly available or electronically available in 1998, what you see is that when Labor's on the rise, when things are going better for them, their fortunes are looking good and they get more money. So here's the data. Remember, Senator Cameron said Liberals always outdo them. 2003 to 2004, New South Wales ALP, $15.3 million, New South Wales Liberals, $10.4 million, National ALP, $6.8 million, National Liberals, $4 million. So that very clearly wrong there, and it would be useful if one of the other Labor senators could acknowledge that correction, and it was not repeated. So we have a situation here where there is 4 amendments, important amendments. I'm certainly very happy to acknowledge that. But why have they been introduced at this stage? They've been introduced at this stage to try and embarrass the Greens. We're not embarrassed. We're very proud of our record on standing up on transparency on political donations, the need to ban and cap political donations, limit election expenditure. We've got a long history of that, and we will continue to do it. But right now, the job before us is Senate voting reform. Now, Senator Cameron has vast experience in negotiating agreements, many good agreements for the workers in the union that he worked for. And he himself knows that when you go into an agreement, you don't pile everything in. You work out your time, you work out your place, you work out your tactics. And that's all that we've done here. So again, for the people listening, people reading the Hansard, this is actually quite unfortunate, because Labor are exposing themselves here. It's actually disappointing, because again this is an area where Labor and the Greens could work together, because we are over time, long over time, in getting these reforms in place. So we know that Labor has committed to this before. It was in, and it's been mentioned in this debate, and I'd just like to pull it into this part of the discussion, that it was in 2010, the Greens-Labor agreement, that some very important points were agreed on. Now, when Senator Collins answered this, it was interesting to note that she didn't deal with that period when Labor were in government and the Labor and the Greens actually had the numbers here in the Senate where we could have passed it. Remember, the Labor's bill gets through the House of Representatives and then it sits in the Senate for a long time. Right through that period, when we could have got it passed, they would never bring it on. So concerning, disappointing, I've got to say, particularly when you look at where we've arrived now, being used in quite an unscrupulous way to attempt to make out, oh, aren't the Greens bad? They don't even vote for their own position. Well, as Senator Di Natale has set out, we have a bill before Parliament. It's a bill that is now before an inquiry. It has the measures that we have worked on for a long time. Good that Labor has picked them up. Labor has included most of them, possibly all of them, in the amendments that are before us now. Issues to do with lowering the threshold on the disclosure of political donations to $1,000, publicly disclosing donations within 8 weeks, banning foreign donations, the need for the Australian Electoral Commission to deal with misleading statements, and overall tighter penalties. Now, that is already before an inquiry. It will be interesting to see how Labor handles that. And so we're ready to work with Labor when we come before that inquiry. So we note there are 4 amendments on these issues. It is good to see that Labor is showing an interest in them, but right now this isn't the appropriate time. I'm sure that most people in Labor know that. We're dealing with Senate voting reform. Let's get that through, and then let's work on the next big area of reform, which needs to be not just transparency, but the bans on caps on political donations coming into political parties, associated entities and all the rest, and limits on election expenditure. There's certainly a lot more to be done. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Senator Wong.
Said then I won't take anywhere near that amount of time. I'll just make a few short points. The Australian Greens are about to vote against propositions that they not only is their policy, but they supported when we put a bill into the Parliament in 2009. And the only justification they have put to the Senate and to their supporters, remember they're voting against their party policy, voting against Greens party policy. Their only justification is, oh, this bill is about something else. Well, this is another opportunity to actually get donation reform up. You can't say you support political donation reform and then vote against lower disclosure thresholds. It's just not logical. And in fact, it's worse than that. It's enormously hypocritical.
Senator Collins.
Thank you, Chair. Now, Senator Rhiannon just made one helpful point, which is, of course, all of our 4 amendments are closely related and related to political donations. And I indicated to Senator Cormann at that stage I was quite happy to deal with them together to facilitate the process. I understand that the House is waiting to deal with the results of this consideration, and I don't want to take longer, given all of the accusations about filibustering, quite inaccurate in my view, than necessarily needs to occur. As Senator Rhiannon indicated, all parties in this chamber are fairly familiar with these issues. Let me run very quickly through the other issues. So we dealt with the disclosure threshold. The next amendments on sheet 7855 deal with foreign donations, where they will prohibit donations of a foreign party. As part of the package of amendments in relation to political donations, the opposition will bring to the Senate as part of this debate, where we have a long-standing commitment to improving standards of transparency and accountability, as I've already indicated. These are important measures that need to be supported, but again, as Senator Wong highlighted, these are also matters that we don't necessarily need to wait to progress after electoral reform. My earlier comments about how Labor in government sought to proceed here were described by Senator Rhiannon, again in a fairly inaccurate way. I drew the comparison to these current measures where we've been very clear in our statements that the preferred approach is to proceed in a more consensual fashion, consistent with how committees such as JSCEM have operated historically. That hasn't occurred here. That was our approach when we were dealing with the political donation issues. Senator Cormann, we didn't feel it was appropriate to impose on the parliament arrangements that Mr Abbott had agreed to and could progress in a more non-partisan fashion, but unfortunately that arrangement fell apart. The other area that we're dealing with here is opposition amendments on sheet 7856 with respect to anonymous donations. These amendments will prohibit anonymous political donations, and again it's part of Labor's broader package of policy measures here. Again, and I think Senator Cameron has made points relevant to all of these measures, important issues if we were going to have a political donation system which has integrity and which has the support of the Australian community at large. These are all important issues and they do not need to wait. What I am disappointed at, however, is the characterisation of myself as proceeding with these in an unscrupulous way. Now, I hope that I misheard at this long hour the nature of Senator Rhiannon's contribution there, because I wouldn't like to think that the chair didn't protect me against such an allegation that I was being unscrupulous. But ultimately the Hansard will show, as indeed the Hansard will show how I was slurred earlier with the suggestion that I had, from one of her colleagues, that I had said that Senator Rhiannon was senile. I would never make those sorts of references, and I can only suspect that that end of the chamber misheard me refer to Senator Rhiannon. I would not have said Senator Rhiannon is senile. I'm pleased I've had the opportunity to clarify that point, but going back to the issues we're trying to deal with in a fairly fastly paced way to facilitate progress, I would seek leave to move all of Labor's amendments at once, and I move those amendments.
Is leave granted? Leave is granted. The question is that opposition amendments 1 on sheet 7854, 1 on sheet 7855, 1 on sheet 7856, 1 on sheet 7857 be moved together and that the amendment be agreed to. All of those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Against say no. No. I think the noes have it. The ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bell for 4 minutes. Whatever, it's been a privilege for me to sit next to you during a, I think could be historic piece of legislation. Yeah, seriously. Yeah. Oh, it's true. I think we all are. Is Gavin coming in or am I?
So the question is that opposition amendments on sheets 7854, 55, 56 and 57 be agreed to.
Why have we done that? It's time, is it? Lock the doors. The question is that opposition amendments on sheet 7. Okay, well, let's do it again. All right. So the question is that opposition amendments on sheet 7854, 55, 56 and 57 be agreed to. The ayes will move to the right of the chair, the noes to the left of the chair. I appoint Senator Urquhart teller for the ayes and Senator Mackenzie teller for the noes.
I have one teller.
Order. There being 22 ayes and 36 noes, the question is resolved in the negative. Senator Muir.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to move my amendments 3 and 1 on sheet 7873 by leave together.
Is leave granted? There being no objection, leave is granted. Senator Muir.
Thank you, Chair. I'll only make a very short contribution in relation to this amendment. This amendment is a sunset clause for the savings provisions. The Minister's spoken very fondly of the AEC and their capabilities on ensuring that the education process about the new electoral reform would be very successful and everybody be able to then know how to best use their vote, even though the rhetoric in this chamber is 1 to 6, although 6 is actually the minimum. In order to encourage that government and the AEC and parties and everybody else is encouraging proper formal votes, I think it's nothing more than appropriate to put a sunset clause in place to the savings provisions, not the bill itself, as much as I love that. Put the sunset clause into the savings provisions to ensure that proper education is put into place. It gives people time to adapt to the proper formal way of voting, and then removed to prevent people and parties using the system which has been deliberately designed to be able to be rorted to their advantage. I can't see how the Greens or the government would oppose this, considering their whole debate is around giving the vote back to the voter, giving their choice of the preference back to the voter. If that's so true, this amendment would, if you would support this amendment, it would actually really support your case, and maybe I'd actually believe you. But at the end of the day, you've got savings provisions in there to collect the 97% of the votes above the line, which you're going to benefit from. And by not supporting this, there's no encouragement whatsoever for you to try to encourage people to vote formally. So I'm happy to put this amendment to the chamber and watch it go down.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Chair. The government does not support these amendments for the reasons that we've previously outlined. We don't believe it's appropriate to remove these savings provisions, which we consider to be necessary and appropriate.
Senator Collins.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. The opposition will not be supporting these amendments. We acknowledge the intention that Senator Muir is indicating, the genuine interest in ensuring that we have an adequate review here, which was indeed why we supported, but unfortunately saw the demise of Senator Wong's amendment for the review. But I suppose in part, as Senator Muir just referred to, we watched the Greens and the coalition block even something as straightforward as an independent review. But nevertheless, we do not support a sunset clause as the best avenue to force a review of this legislation, and for that reason we can't support Senator Muir's amendments.
The question is that amendments 3 and 1 on sheet 7873 be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Against say no. No. I think the noes have it. Division required. Ring the bells. Lock the doors. The question is that amendments 3 and 1 on sheet 7873 be agreed to. The ayes will move to the right of the chair, the noes to the left of the chair. I appoint Senator Muir teller for the ayes and Senator Urquhart teller for the noes.
Thank you.
Order. There being 6 ayes and 50 noes, the question is resolved in the negative. The question now is that this bill as amended be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Against say no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes. Lock the doors. The question is that the bill as amended be agreed to. The ayes will move to the right of the chair, the noes to the left of the chair. I appoint Senator Mackenzie teller for the ayes and Senator Urquhart teller for the noes. Order. There being 37 ayes and 24 noes, the question is resolved in the affirmative. The question now is that the bill be reported. Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Against say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
The committee has considered the Commonwealth Electoral Amendment Bill 2016 and agreed to it with amendments. I call the Minister.
Mr. President, I move that the report of the committee be adopted.
The question is that motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. Lock the doors. The doors have been locked. The question is that the bill be reported, be adopted. The report of the committee be adopted. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left of the chair. I appoint Senator Mackenzie teller for the ayes, Senator Urquhart teller for the noes. Order. There being 36 ayes and 24 noes, the matter is resolved in the affirmative. I call the Minister.
Mr. President, I move that this bill be now read a third time. And in moving the third reading of this bill, may I thank all senators who have participated in this debate for their contribution. This, it is fair to say, has been a rather lengthy debate. Obviously, the government is of the view that this is a very important reform for Australia. It's a reform which will help ensure that future Senate election results truly reflect the will of the Australian people. It is a reform which will empower voters to direct their preferences according to their wishes, instead of having them traded and directed by backroom operators in political parties through insufficiently transparent group voting ticket arrangements. I thank the Senate for the work over what has been a debate that has been going for nearly 39 hours since the message of the House of Representatives was received on the 29th of February 2016. I believe that that is the seventh longest debate on any piece of legislation since 1990. And we have, of course, over the past 20 or so hours had a very intensive debate, 20 continuous hours of debate on this legislation, taking us to this point today. I would like to pay a particular tribute to the very active participants in this debate tonight, Senators Wong and Collins, and Senator Di Natale and Rhiannon, and also Senators Xenophon, Leinhelm, Day, and also Ricky Muir, Senator Muir, who have all made a very active contribution, who have put the effort into drafting amendments to improve the bill in the way that they saw fit. The Senate has made a judgment in relation to the form of the bill that should go forward. The government supports the final form of this bill. We will be supporting the bill as amended by the Senate as a government in the House of Representatives, and this will mean that for any future election after the 1st of July 2016, this will be the voting arrangements that will apply for the Australian Senate. And that is a good thing, because it means that people across Australia will be able to determine what happens to their vote, and I thank the Senate for their support for this important government proposal.
Thank you, Minister. Senator Wong.
Thank you, Mr. President. On the third reading, well, it says everything about this government, that their most urgent bill on the eve of an election is not about helping Australians, but about helping themselves. It is not about jobs for Australians, it is about jobs for coalition senators and Green senators. Mr. President, the Senate has just spent a day and night and a part of the day debating the Coalition Greens deal on Senate voting, a timetable forced on it by a government and a Prime Minister determined to get the keys it needs for a double dissolution, and a Greens leader and party that's happy to oblige. We've had an unreasonable and chaotic timetable on this legislation, which has been forced on us by this government by its failure to have a proper process, because it is so desperate and so determined to get the keys for a double dissolution in the timeframe it wants. Now, the Senate did go through last night a very lengthy process where many things were disclosed, including, for example, that the government, the minister has failed to rule out just one vote advocacy and confirmed marking just one vote above the line would be formal, and I think anyone who understands the voting system will understand the implications of that. We also have seen demonstrated here in this chamber a new phase of the relationship between Senator Di Natale's Greens party and the Liberal Party. A new phase in the relationship, a new dimension of closeness. I won't go through all the ways in which that's been demonstrated, as they voted with the coalition time after time, but it was most clearly demonstrated by one of the recent votes this morning, where the Greens political party, who have been arguing for greater transparency in political donations, have voted against their policy, voted against greater transparency on a bill they knew the government had to pass. We could have had political donation reform today. We could have had donation reform today. Mr. President, Senator Cormann has spoken of the lengthy debate. It has been a lengthy debate, not as lengthy as the CPRS debate, which I think was some 63 hours, which he was also a participant in. Mr. President, there's been a lot of talk about principle in this debate. I would say to the chamber and to those listening, this has never been a debate about principle. It has been a debate about short and long-term political advantage. That is what it has been about. It has been about the short-term advantage and the long-term advantage. The short-term advantage, the ability and the tools to go to a double dissolution, and the long-term advantage of what this means for the Greens and the coalition. It will mean up to 3 million votes going in the bin or being corralled, effectively going in the bin or being corralled to one of the major parties or the Greens. This is legislation which is about purging the Senate of minor parties and independents. We in this place, and I would remind people of this, we have acknowledged two things that are very important. One, that Labor would be advantaged by this. Labor would be advantaged. But we don't think the national interest would be. And the second point we have made is, yes, there are issues that should be addressed in voting reform in relation to preferences, but this bill before us creates a whole set of different problems and a whole set of implications for the franchise. We on this side do not support this legislation, and we think it is very disappointing that the Australian Greens are risking over time the coalition getting a working majority in this place. And we all know from the 2014 budget what their agenda will be and what that will mean to working people and marginalised people in this country. In that light, Mr. President, and bearing in mind the time, I move the third reading amendment pursuant to Standing Order 1223, standing in my name on sheet 7894, which has been circulated in the chamber.
The question is the amendment moved by Senator Wong be agreed to. Senator Rhiannon.
Today, the 17th of March, is a most significant day for democracy. We have achieved Senate voting reform. Now, yes, many other improvements are needed. Many other improvements are needed, but today clearly has been advanced for our democratic processes. First off, I think on this point, I mean, just let's quieten down for a moment. I think this is where we would have unity. There's people in this building who have been working continuously, some for 30 hours, I've just found out. So let's come together and thank the attendants here. And a particular thank you to John, our senior attendant, who I understand has done over 30 hours straight. Then there's the security, the clerks themselves, the Comcar drivers and everybody else who have kept this building going so we could do our work. Important work, but that's a huge contribution. The journey for Senate voting reform, for reform of upper house voting, started for the Greens and for myself in 1999 in New South Wales. It's actually been what was achieved there and been achieved here is quite similar. But it is time for some thank yous for the people who have helped us on that journey. First off, the person who actually suggested how to deal with this very challenging situation that occurred in New South Wales when 81 parties in 1999 ran, 81 parties on what became known as a giant tablecloth ballot paper election. Paul Fitzgerald, an author, a Marrickville councillor and the founding member of the New South Wales Greens, came up with a very simple idea. And remember, for all the debate we've had, the beauty of this legislation is actually in its simplicity. And Paul Fitzgerald came up with that idea, is that it doesn't need to be the backroom deals, it can be the voters. The ballot paper doesn't need to change. What will just change is that the voters can put 1, 2, 3, number all the boxes if they like. In the case of New South Wales, or just 1. So again, the simplicity, giving it back to the voters. But on top of that, I am very proud of the role the Greens at federal level have played. And it was after the 2004 election that the then Greens leader, Bob Brown, rang me to ask me about our experience in New South Wales, because he realised that the Senate needed similar reform. And that's when Bob worked on his first bill. Former Senator Bob Brown worked on his first bill. It was 2004 for Senate voting reform. Then there's been more bills, And then our next leader, Christine Milne, took it up with great passion. And I remember one of her final speeches in the party room before she left us was to impress on us how important this is. And she actually foreshadowed it would be difficult, it would be challenging, but just to stick with it. And then our current leader, Richard Di Natale, Senator Richard Di Natale, has picked this up with an equal passion, and it's been a pleasure to work with him. I did just want to say to the House that unfortunately one of our members, Senator Nick McKim, has not been able to be with us. He was here on Tuesday, and yet again he often talked to me with his great commitment to this reform. He was very excited about it. But he received the sad news that his father was dying and he had to leave us. But one of those little stories, one of those personal stories that we all have, that his dad didn't actually want him to go back home. His dad knew what was happening. Dad was very proud of him, obviously, wanted him to stay here. He went home, and one of his final words was, "Give him hell." So we missed you, Nick, but it meant a lot to us. But then there's the experts who really have assisted all of us, and we've quoted different people. But I did want to particularly thank Anthony Green, George Williams, Ken Bonham, and many, many others who took time with submissions, becoming witnesses to the inquiries that we've had. And then I also wanted to say a particular thank you to my colleagues under JSEM. On JSEM, we all know when we work on committees, there's quite an interesting dynamic. You become friends and colleagues with people who, in many other areas, you don't agree with. So Tony Smith, the now Speaker of the House of Representatives, then, when I went on to JSEM, was the chair of that. Did a very fine job. Really fine job. Gary Gray, Alan Griffin, gave a great deal of expertise to that committee. And that first JSEM committee, coming out of that 2013 election, remember at this time we're a unity ticket. Like it had been a unity ticket in New South Wales with all parties. All parties agreed when the New South Wales Greens put up that proposal, let's have optional preferential voting. That's how we started the journey at a federal level. All parties were on board. JSEM was united. If you look at the report, unity in that report. And so I particularly want to thank, as I said, Tony Smith, Gary Gray, Alan Griffin. But I think in terms of our final thank yous, it goes to somebody very special to this House, and that is former Senator John Faulkner. The contribution he made in so many areas is outstanding, and I think we all know that this House misses him, whatever party you come from. But he made a very, very pertinent comment about this very legislation. He said, "I would say this reform is uncontroversial and it is certainly overdue." So again, to finish up, the beauty of this reform that we're dealing with here today is really in its simplicity. The beauty of this reform is really in its simplicity. For all the complexity, for all the arguments that we've been through, it comes down to one significant change, and that is the voter, they're going to still get their ballot paper. What they will be doing won't be that different. The instructions will be slightly different, but they will be able to allocate their own preferences above or below the line. Above the line, they will be instructed to vote 1 to 6 at least. Below the line, 1 to 12 at least. That is a really excellent progress in our democratic process. One of the wonderful things that I've learned in hearing from Australian Electoral Commission and the many times that they give evidence is their deep commitment to ensure that votes, that where the intent of the voter is clear, that vote is counted. And I do believe with these reforms that we will see a greater participation. It was disappointing to hear Senator Wong again go on about the issue of the divisions that she sees, that she was trying to flare up around donations. The Greens have a solid commitment. Absolutely, you can't blemish this one in terms of our commitment to political donations reform. What Labor did today, they'll get out there with their social media, etc., but it was just a tactic. It was just a tactic to try and pull this down, because they know if we had voted in this chamber and got a majority for political donation, those measures that they put forward, we would not have Senate voting reform. And Senator Doug Cameron, I made these comments when you were out of the chamber. You have done so many negotiations in your life for working people, for workers in the metal industry, in the manufacturing industry, and you know, probably more than anyone, that you don't bundle everything into your negotiations.
Order.
Into your negotiations. And finally, we started on this journey with a unity ticket. We had the unity ticket, as I said, in New South Wales. We had the unity ticket here. Labor jumped overboard. They were the ones that decided that they were going to give it away. They've ended on the wrong side of history. They've been left in the back room, and there's no backroom dealers there with them. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Rhiannon. Senator Linehill.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, this is a sad note to end a rather difficult couple of days. I described this as a dirty little deal when I first heard about it a couple of weeks ago. It has got no cleaner in that time. This dirty little deal between the Greens and the Liberals could just as easily be called the Rhiannon re-election bill, or perhaps the get rid of annoying small parties bill. We saw in the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters right from the beginning there was no representation of minor parties. There was no representation of independents. Only Nick Xenophon was on that Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters. It was a fix-up. It was a fix-up right from the start. It was a fix-up at the end. The hearing was a charade. The hypocrisy was rampant. And speaking of hypocrisy, the Greens, in the process of giving their support for this bill with the government, abandoned its commitment to every vote, every time on same-sex marriage. It voted for the gag over and over again, and of course abandoned its interest in changes to political donations. From the government's point of view, I honestly don't understand why they've pursued this. It won't improve the Senate. It won't overcome the fact that the Senate is a logjam at times. It wasn't actually a logjam with the crossbench, but it will be under these rules. It won't wipe out the crossbench, but there will be less of them. There will be less of them. It will make it a lot less democratic. There will be fewer crossbench senators, and small parties starting off will find it incredibly difficult unless they happen to have multi-millionaire backers who fund their campaign. Nobody pretends that the old election rules, as they now are, were perfect. The crossbench never said they were. The crossbench never defended them. And in fact, we had agreed on what we thought were perfectly reasonable remedies, but our voices were swamped in this dirty little deal. It is no improvement.
Thank you, Senator Linehill. The question is that the third reading amendment moved by Senator Wong be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Those against say no. No. I think the noes have it. Division required. Ring the bells. Lock the doors. The question is the third reading amendment moved by Senator Wong be agreed to. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left of the chair. I appoint Senator Urquhart, teller for the ayes, Senator Mackenzie, teller for the noes. Order. Order on both sides. Order. Senator Dastiari, I can still see you all and hear you all, so we're still functioning. There being 23 ayes and 36 noes, the matter is resolved in the negative. The question now is that the bill be read a third time. Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Those against say no. No. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. Lock the doors. The question is that the bill be now read a third time. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left of the chair. I appoint Senator Mackenzie, teller for the ayes, Senator Urquhart, teller for the noes. Order. Order. There being 36 ayes and 23 noes, the motion is carried in the affirmative. I call the clerk.
A bill for an act to amend the Commonwealth Electoral Act 1918 and for related purposes. Government business, order of the day, appropriation